Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Gretchen Wall, Produce Safety Alliance Coordinator. I think we're going to go ahead and get started with the meeting, but this afternoon is actually our monthly call for the Produce Safety Alliance Educators Group, as well as a joint call with the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety. So we welcome those from NECAFs who haven't joined our meetings before. And if you haven't joined this meeting before, just to let you all know, you will be muted through the main portions of the presentations, and we may give some time for questions and answer sessions, but you need to be connected to the actual WebEx meeting through your audio for me to be able to unmute your line for you to ask questions. So if you're just calling in today, I won't be able to unmute you, unfortunately, but definitely take a look at the connection info under your event info tab on the upper left-hand corner. This call is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording both on the Produce Safety Alliance website. It's under the Resources tab, and then underneath that, it's under the Educators Call information. And as well, it'll be posted on the NECAF's website after the call is over, along with some notes. So if you need to leave early, we will be recording the call and sending out some notes after the call is over. As a general agenda, in a minute here, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Newbold to give some updates for NECAFs. And then we're going to get into some content related to a recent meeting that we held here in Geneva, New York at the end of March, which was the Soil Summit. Give you an idea of what the purpose of that meeting was, some of our goals and objectives, and at least give you some initial highlights and observations from that meeting. And then we also have Dave Ingram on the line from the FDA produce safety staff, and he's going to talk about FDA risk assessment activities and research and some of the work that they're currently doing on the guidance for the produce safety rule, especially as it relates to the biological soil amendments of animal origin. And then we're going to wrap up in talking about what are our next steps related to this topic area. What are we going to do with the information that we collected at the Soil Summit, including circulating the notes back to the participants of that meeting and developing a white paper, and then our plans for engaging with other work groups and working with others that are interested in actually hosting a Soil Summit in their region or in their state. So what I'd like to do is actually turn it over to Elizabeth Newbold. And Elizabeth, I just gave you presenter status, so feel free to advance the slides at your own pace.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. So
yep.
I just wanted to give a very quick overview. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Northeast Center to Advance Food Safety, or NECAFs, is we are the Northeast regional center that covers 12 states in the District of Columbia, and we work to advance the understanding and practice of improved food safety among the region's small and medium-sized produce growers and processors. So NECAFs is one of 4 regional centers established by the FDA and the USDA, tasked to coordinate training, education, outreach, related support to small and medium-sized producers and processors who are affected by FSMA. And many of you may remember Chris Callahan, who is the project lead, did an overview of NECAFs through the PSA Educator Group call last fall. And that is recorded and on the PSA website, so you can go and look at that for a full overview of the work of NECAFs. And I just wanted to quickly give you this information. If you're not already connected to NECAFs, we would love to have you join our network just to be part of our communication so that you can hear about the work that we're doing and you can tell us about the work that you're doing and help us to build a greater network of collaboration across the region. And I wanted to point out at the very bottom of this slide some upcoming events that the Northeast Regional Center is doing. So the Produce Safety Alliance is hosting a Train the Trainer in Geneva, New York in May. And one of the things I want to highlight is that NECAFs supports financially folks who want to become PSA trainers and lead trainers. So some of you may already be trained and don't have a need for that financial support, but if you know of others who you work with that are interested in being a trainer, but financial support would help, please reach out to me or Chris, and we can help you get more information about that. And also, I wanted to point out that 2 Fridays from now, on the 19th of May, NECAF will be hosting another webinar, and this will be a regional roundtable where folks from our region will talk about food safety projects that they're working on. So if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll get information about that, and we'll hope that you can all join us for that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Gretchen. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And as Michelle just pointed out to me in a frantic message through the chat box, I actually got those dates wrong for the Train the Trainer course that I'm going to be hosting. It's actually going to be hosted on May 16th and 17th, which is a Tuesday, Wednesday in Geneva. So I'll make that correction when I send out the notes in the slide. But I apologize for that, and thank you, Michelle, for pointing that out. So it'll be May 16th and 17th in Geneva. Okay, so what I'd like to do is actually turn it over to Betsy Bin, the Director of the Produce Safety Alliance, to go through a brief summary of some of the highlights from the Soil Summit. Betsy?
Thanks. Thanks very much. And I think I bear some of the responsibility on the mistake on those days, so I apologize as well. So what we're going to do in these next few slides is give you a really high-level overview of what went on at the Soil Summit. We are still working on the actual final output, so I don't want anybody to think this is sort of the final answer, but we did want to share it, and when Elizabeth and Chris talked to us about co-hosting, we thought it would be a good way to reach more people. We are also going to have Dave Ingram talk after I'm done, so there will be that FDA piece. Really, we had talked about doing a soil summit for quite a long time, and it really circulates around subpart F, which is the biological soil amendments of animal origin. And in the original proposed Food Safety Modernization Act's Produce Safety Rule, there was a 9-month application interval between the application of biological soil amendments of animal origin and the harvest of produce crops. That received a lot of comments to FDA, and when the final rule came out, that section was marked as reserved, that they were going to wait to establish an application interval pending additional research and additional risk assessments based on what they knew was going on. I think everyone realizes that there is a need to support and to better understand the use of manures, compost, everything on the farm, because it's a very complex system with lots of things that impact it. Food safety risks, environmental impacts, crop nutrient needs, farm resources, labor needs, sanitation issues, and what do we really know about some of the information? How long do pathogens survive? What's the difference between aged versus fully composted? There's just a lot of questions, and so we wanted to get together and talk about that. So the Soil Summit goals were to, A, give the FDA a chance to provide some clarification on what subpart F requirements were actually in the rule, give the growers a chance to hear that information, talk about what FDA is doing now that that section's reserved, what are they doing in terms of research and risk assessment activities, and to give the growers and the participants at this meeting a chance to share and discuss what are current uses of raw manure in fruit and vegetable farms, what are challenges, barriers to adopting composting practices, because composting is one way to reduce those risks, but there's barriers to it. There's also benefits from a food safety standpoint. And to talk about, are there key educational resources that are missing? There's lots of groups with information about compost, but are these materials meeting the need? Is there stuff that's missing? What else could growers use to help better understand and implement practices to reduce risks? I think the other thing we were really focused on was trying to identify what areas need additional research for us to fully understand the risks associated with use of different types of soil amendments. So what did we expect when we organized this? We really were hoping that we would all gain a better understanding of the produce safety rule requirements that are in Subpart F. But we really wanted a better understanding of soil amendments used on fruit and vegetable farms, how growers were using it, what their thoughts were in terms of risks, barriers, challenges, all that stuff. We wanted to come up with a result, I guess. When you look at the third bullet and it says develop a framework, what we were kind of hoping to come up with was what else is needed? What do we need to assess risks, to minimize risks? Everything from research to educational outcomes or needs that need to be filled. We also wanted to be able to know where the challenges to using compost. And I think some very interesting things came out about that particular piece that I didn't necessarily see coming. Maybe other people have more information in this area, but it was very interesting to hear the many different breakout group summaries and to hear what they discussed about handling and compost and raw manure use. And also, as I said earlier, we really did want to know what research is missing. And I think that, to me, really comes to the identification of all the different types of amendments that are being used. And then finally, we do want to publish something to share all this information with others. And you're going to see in a moment why that becomes important with some of the other outcomes that happened. So to give you an idea of who was at this meeting, we had a total of 70 attendees. Here's the breakout. That big blue section, you know, lots of academic types, researchers, extension, but state agencies, federal agencies, grower organizations and associations, so people representing growers, their organizations, growers themselves. We were happy to see people from the compost and waste management industry, people who are involved in making compost. We had other industry people such as retailers and then other, and if you move, as we move to the next slide, you'll see a more clarity to the origin of where these people came from. From academia, we had people from a pretty good swath of the country. New York, Maryland, West Virginia, California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Michigan, Vermont, Purdue, which is in Indiana. Sorry, I did everybody else by state, left Purdue as Purdue. State agencies, many from the Northeast, but also some from North Carolina and West Virginia. Federal agencies, certainly representation from USDA AMS and USDA NRCS as well as FDA. And grower organizations, again, from California, Florida, groups that have, such as the National Young Farmers Coalition, that have representation really in many states throughout the nation. So we did have good representation from a lot of groups. Again, National Sustainable Ag Coalition has representation nationwide. So a good swath of grower organizations. Retailers like Wegmans, the Produce Marketing Association, and then composters, people directly involved in generating compost or dealing with waste management. And then certainly what I view as a really key important component is the growers themselves. So we did have growers from New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, and Connecticut, which I think is really important. So here's what we did. We started the day with presentations. So presentations from FDA on clarifications and backgrounds to Subpart F, explaining what's in there, current efforts on risk assessment, again another FDA talk by Amir, and then Dave came back and talked about the technical forum on produce safety that FDA has. So a really good, solid foundation to start the day on where FDA is at with what they're doing. I then did a presentation on challenges regarding compliance with FSMA, what we're seeing when we talk to growers, where we think some of the issues are at. Then, after that was essentially the morning. In the afternoon, we really started the breakout session, and this was the theme that carried really the rest of the Soil Summit. We did 3 different breakout sessions, 2 on day 1. Those 2 sessions were identifying and clarifying current raw manure use and practices. And then the second breakout was challenges to using raw manure and transitioning to compost. We did a little bit of a recap on day 1, came up with ideas we were going to carry into day 2. Started off day 2 with giving people a chance to talk about, after they had had all evening to have dinner and think about it and talk to other people, what were some takeaways, what were they feeling like were topics that either needed more discussion or that they had come away with so far. We had a great presentation by Jean Bonital from Cornell Waste Management Institute on compost quality and use. I think we could have given her an easy half day to run a workshop on that, but it was great to have that presentation. And then we wrapped up by talking about what education resources and funding do we need out there to help growers move forward with reducing risks related to raw manure and compost use. And then we sort of wrapped up the day. So it was compact, it was pretty intense. We worked the crew and the participants, I think, really hard, because in those breakout sessions, people really had to participate. So what was the structure of those breakout sessions? We had 8 groups. What we did prior to them getting there, I say that we lovingly, what Gretchen did prior to them getting there was we looked at the layout of the people that we had from those pie chart representations that I showed you earlier, and we tried to make sure that each group had representation from those groups so that they were a diverse mix of participants. We gave them 30 minutes in the topic area. They had to pick a facilitator, or we had a facilitator just to guide discussion, make sure there were notes. They were not the lead. There were other people in the group sort of leading the discussion, and then each group prioritized their outcomes and picked someone from the group, not necessarily not the facilitator, to make that presentation to the group. Here's what our initial thoughts are on the Soil Summit, just to give you an idea of some of the just broad spectrum stuff. There were a lot of very diverse viewpoints and opinions. I think when you look at the people that were there, retailers, growers, industry grower representatives, government entities, state entities, federal, state, local entities, and very, very different perspectives. What are your goals? What are we trying to do? The breakouts had a lot of interesting outcomes. Some you could say were across the board in multiple groups. Some were individual per group. So that was sort of interesting to see. And what I'm going to do in the next few slides is talk about some of the highlights. But I want to make it clear that this is not the summary paper, right? This is not necessarily what you're going to see in the paper, but this is just our broad overview. We are going to talk about what we plan at the very end after Dave's had a chance to talk. So things that came out regarding raw manure use. Many growers feel like they are going to keep using raw manure because it's available and there's barriers to transitioning to compost. I think one of the things that's very interesting is coming up with standard and consistent definitions for soil amendments. In the rule does a pretty good job of saying what it thinks is raw versus treated, right? What is raw soil amendment versus a treated soil amendment? But within those classes, there's aged manure. There's manure that is clearly having some sort of treatment, if not a standardized compost treatment. And does that change the risks that are there? Manure is available in states where we have animal operations. It's affordable, but growers really are trying to balance that risk of food safety, nutrient management, meeting buyer demand is another one I would put up here, because some buyers really don't want folks using raw manure. And raw manure for some operations is really viewed as being critical. Again, if you have animals and you have manure to get rid of, you got to use it. You don't want it contaminating the environment. And some organic operations really see it as a critical input to their soils. When we looked at compost, I think for me, one of the interesting things that came out regarding barriers, including cost, labor, access to equipment to get it done, the one that really caught me off guard was the transportation cost. That came up quite a bit, and I'm hoping that in the white paper we'll be able to dig a little deeper in that to talk more specifically about those economics. Composting practices can reduce risks. I think people saw that as a key thing. But there is concern when you get raw manure on the farm and now you're moving it, or you have to have an area where you keep it, preventing cross-contamination, cleaning, sanitation practices, all of that. Another interesting one was feedstocks. One of the comments that was made by one of the participants was, we've never had more compost available in the U.S. ever, was his opinion. But that makes feedstocks valuable. So if you are making more compost, what are you making that compost out of? A big discussion about what suppliers know and do not know about requirements in FSMA, what records are required, what are growers going to be asking for, and conveying information to growers about the benefits of compost. Peer-to-peer learning, wanting growers to be able to talk to each other about those benefits and challenges. In terms of education and outreach, which I think gets us to our last breakout session, I think there's a lot to learn, both from the grower side, educator side. I know personally, I feel like I still have a lot to learn about this. I think Jean's presentation really highlighted the complexity of the topic. Tailoring educational materials to meet different audiences' needs, you know, a small composting operation versus a large animal operation that may even have a digester attached to it, organic farms versus conventional versus growers who have, again, animals, fruits and vegetables, eggs, all of those varieties, and what changes as we move around the country. We did have representation from California, and it was interesting to hear discussion of what goes on in California versus what goes on in, say, smaller farms in the Northeast. The idea of a systems approach was, I think, very important because the soil amendments really get to a lot of different aspects: safety, soil health, fertility, tilth, the quality of the fruits and vegetables coming off of that soil, worker health and hygiene. All of that stuff sort of comes into there, and I think it needs to be incorporated into that holistic approach. I guess I should have put a summary slide in here for myself. But those were sort of the major themes. I'm going to turn it over to Dave, but before I do, I'd like to stop here and see if there's any questions I can answer.
So if you have any questions, you can actually raise your hand, and then I can unmute you. Or feel free to type them into the chat box as well. I believe there might have been a question from earlier on that I see in the queue. So Nick Andrews, I'm going to unmute you. Nick, do you still have a question?
No, that was just a technical question, but with the webinar, do you know when the publication is going to be available, though, the summary?
I don't believe we've set a date yet because we actually haven't circulated the notes from the meeting back to the group yet. So I would imagine that we're going to work on it through the summer and maybe target something later in the fall or early winter.
Thanks.
Yep. I did get a question about what about manure tea and compost tea. I'm not sure what about them the question is. If the question is, were they discussed, the answer is yes. If the question is related to how they're outlined in subpart F or what their use is in the rule, okay, how are they fitting in the, oh, there you go, that's good. Thank you, Arnold, for clarifying. How are manure teas and compost teas fitting into the risk assessment by FDA? I am going to actually leave that question for Dave. So if Dave is on the line and he can unmute himself, he might want to answer that.
Hey, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. I'm actually on travel right now, and before I start, I should tell you I have to leave in about 45 minutes to catch a flight if I want to get home tonight. So I do appreciate being a part of this discussion. It's very important to FDA. And as far as manure teas and compost teas, or agricultural teas is what FDA now calls all teas that are used as soil amendments. They're agricultural teas. Depending on whether or not these items are covered under Subpart F will depend on what you're using to prepare the tea. If you're using a biological soil amendment of animal origin to prepare your tea, that means to brew the tea. So most growers might use compost, for example. Well, compost is a big definition. I would then ask what you're using to make the compost with. If you're using any manure source, obviously, to make the compost, then that would be covered under the Subpart F. So as far as the risk assessment goes, we are focusing more on manure usage specifically, untreated biological soil amendments of animal origin, such as manure use on the farm, how it's used, where it's used, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with a summary slide. So manure teas, agricultural teas will be addressed, but not directly through the risk assessment. Any future regulations that FDA entertains in 5 to 10 years would include provisions associated with agricultural teas, as long as they're untreated. So anyway, hope that answers your question. We did have a lot of discussions about this topic at the summit.
All right, thanks, Dave, for that clarification. Yep. I saw two other questions come in. I'm going to unmute Michael O'Donnell. Do you have a question? Michael O'Donnell, you have a question? Yep, I can hear you.
Yep. Okay, all right. I saw the one summary point about that some compost suppliers likely wouldn't be prepared to have the required records or paperwork that would be required under the produce rule. Was there discussion about that same issue with suppliers of other types of soil amendments, biological soil amendments of animal origin, feather meal, bone meal, pelletized products, things like that? Because that's another place where I'm seeing some challenges, is getting that required paperwork.
So I guess I'll jump in if you don't mind.
Nope, not at all.
Gretchen. Okay, hey Betsy. So the requirements for third-party suppliers are actually quite simple. We did talk a little bit about this at the summit, and we will have some guidance documents that are coming out. The guidance documents for Subpart F are now under final review, and so I talked a little bit about that as well at the summit. But as far as specific records are required, any grower that procures, well, first of all, we're not regulating the composting industry. We're not regulating any commercial entity that produces a treated BSAO. That's not our mission. Our mission is to make sure the growers are sourcing from appropriate sources depending on their needs. So it is up to the grower to seek some of documentation, such as a certificate of conformity or certificate of analysis from that supplier that simply states their product has been treated in accordance with Subpart F 112.54 A or B, depending on what treatment level the grower needs. So what exactly that looks like, we had some discussion about, 10,000, does FDA, are we looking for 10,000 temperature time turning data points for composters? No. No, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised by what we will be looking for, but I can't speak exactly what that looks like until the guidance comes out, unfortunately. But I do encourage, highly encourage, and this is one of the benefits of the summit in our eyes, that really stimulated conversation among the attendees to reach out to FDA. We've been having some discussions with composters, commercial composters, that are coming forth with actual records that they would like us to, that they would like to supply to their growers, so for our consideration. So I encourage all third-party BSAO suppliers to submit what they would like to see, and we'll take a look at it and make sure that everybody's concerns are addressed.
Okay, I think we had one more question, so if you don't mind, we'll go to James Theory's question. James, you're unmuted.
I do not think my question is relevant to this talk because it's about soil amendments. I was wondering whether manures were discussed in aquaponic systems, but so it's not relevant. You can disregard.
Okay. All right. Well, then, Dave, I'm going to pass the ball to you, and you can get started with your part of the presentation. Give me 1 second here. Okay. There you go.
All right. Thank you. So I have command of the slides, I'm guessing?
Yep. Yeah. And the advancing is at the top of your screen.
All right, my screen is so
You
small.
got it.
Okay, here we go.
Got it.
Okay, this is fantastic. Well, thank you everybody for coming out today. You know, this is really an exciting time for FDA. We've got a heck of a lot of moving parts, and the more we communicate those parts to our constituents, the easier time everybody will have down the road. So, soil amendments. Soil amendments is my deal. I've been working since the original proposed came out, and I think you would all have to agree that FDA has gone a long way, maybe even a marathon, to address a lot of the concerns growers were having with the original proposed that Betsy had summarized earlier. We've gone a long way to address those concerns in the supplemental. We've gone a little bit further to address them in the final produce safety rule. And perhaps the most exciting thing for me as a microbiologist is to conduct something as large as a risk assessment for understanding the health risks associated with the use of manure on the farms. This is an incredible task. FDA's participation at the Soil Summit, I think, was great. I think we really appreciated the opportunity to, not only dispel some myths and confusions that everybody was having with the rule itself. I mean, the rule is extremely hard to read. I think one of the successful, what made the summit so successful was that nobody expected FDA to step up and talk in a conversational style to the grower community in a manner that was, more of extension level than FDA codified speak. So I did my best to break down the codified in a manner that was understandable, and I tried to lay out my vision for the guidance document and walk through the steps. And this was a Q&A. This was back and forth throughout the day. As somebody had a question, they just blurted out. And that anyone who is interested in hosting one of these events, and I do think we need to do more of these. I've received, heard some chatter about a southern summit. I'd like to see a western summit, maybe a north central summit or Midwest summit would be great. every region handles manure differently. We're getting a good understanding of how growers use manure, mechanisms they use, when growers use manure. And this is so critical for FDA to understand these principles. And I walked away from the summit with my head held high, with a smile on my face. I made so many contacts that have been providing information to us directly. I was very pleased to learn, FDA did not learn too many new things at the summit, which told me we're handling this process very well. But we did learn some things, and that's why we need to, we'll do our best to get around to different venues, because as I mentioned, every region will handle manure a little differently. So where are we in the process? We've done, this last year has been an explosion of the produce safety rule in terms of reach and outreach, and we're moved from phase 1, which is development and guidance development, into phase 2 and phase 3 for implementation, and so this has been a lot of activity, a lot of growing pains. At the summit, we had several of FDA's Produce Safety Network personnel in the room, which was fantastic because they were introduced, their roles, their understandings, their mission were broadcast to everyone, and so wherever future summits are held, they will be hopefully, included. The Produce Safety Network personnel will be included in those regions. But the PSN, Produce Safety Network personnel, are our front lines for guidance and outreach and education of the produce safety rule. They are getting an excellent handle on grower-specific needs. The Produce Safety Network is broadcasting those needs directly to the regulatory side in College Park, and that's where the fun starts. And so that's our process. The guidance development, as I mentioned, is going on right now. Every subpart is under review and will be released soon. The guidance that's coming, that will be released first, as I understand, is basically the compliance guide. These guidance documents are being developed to help you figure out and understand what applies to your operations and how you can comply, how FDA expects you to comply with the provisions in the produce rule. The next document that will be released are a little broader. There are recommendations, basically good agricultural practices that go far above and beyond what FDA expects you to do to comply with the rule. I think probably I saw a lot of light bulbs going off in people's eyes as I was discussing the subpart F in the room, in terms of, wow, FDA really is not going to require much. We're doing above and beyond what FDA is expecting us to do. This is great. So I think that was an eye-opener for a lot of people. The produce safety rule is basically a minimalist approach to setting the bare bones regulations, what FDA expects your operations to do to produce safe food. But we would like to see a lot more. And that's where the GAPS guidance comes out. Sprout guidance is already out, and the small entity compliance guide is already in the works. My structure for the talk at the summit includes a slide of all of the subparts. No, not subparts, but the provisions in the rule. So subpart F involves understanding biological soil amendments of animal origin. If you're not using a biological soil amendments of animal origin, you're not covered by the subpart. So we had a lot of discussion about what constitutes a BSAAO. We talked about how they're supposed to be handled and conveyed properly, what the minimal requirements FDA expects you to follow for those to comply with that subpart. I have, when biosolids topic came up as well, a lot of discussion about biosolids, what they were, how they're used, and how EPA's regulations, 503 regulations, are acceptable in the eyes of FDA in terms of food safety. So I have two highlighted provisions there, and this is where we've received most of our comment and discussion and questions through the Technical Assistance Network, the TAN. So I really stress this point in that during the development of the Produce Safety Rule Subpart F regulations, these two, 112.54 and 112.55, they really should have, it would have been better to have them merged together, because wherever you see 112.54A, you will see 112.55A. For example, if you're creating a treated BSAO, the treatment process that meets 112.54A has to be scientifically validated to meet the microbial standards in 112.55A. So these two sort of go hand in hand. Wherever you see one, you see the other. And I think that confusion really bled over to a lot of questions about what does FDA require? What testing methods do FDA require to test for the treated, what microbial standards does FDA require to treat BSA or to look for BSAOs? The FDA does not require testing of BSAOs. We require validation of the treatment processes as a mechanism to make sure the BSAO is safe that comes out of that process. So I talked a little bit about application or the record section at the bottom, 112.60. We can't really speak more about records until the guidance comes out, and we intend to provide a template for what the records for third-party BSAOs will look like, or grower-supplied BSAOs, which will require a little bit more in terms of what treatment process are you using on your farm and has it been validated. There were a lot of composters in the room. There was even a vermicomposter in the room who has provided a lot of good materials to my office to show, to review, to get a better understanding of how vermicomposting operations can control foodborne pathogens. I really look forward to diving deep into that topic. I think that's very interesting and up-and-coming industry. So where does the risk assessment play in all this? The risk assessment will help solidify requirements around application requirements. And this is all in 112.56. In 112.56, we have removed all days to harvest restrictions around the use of untreated biological soil amendments of animal origin until further notice. And we are really doing a great job in this arena to figure out the human health capacity, or the human health component for the use of these amendments. So this is an example of, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is an example of what I walked through at the Soil Summit. Basically, the guidance document, my vision for the guidance document is going to break down your operation into 6 steps. If you're using a BSAO, then you need to follow these steps. So the first step, obviously, is determine if you're using a BSAO, and this is not quite as straightforward as you might think. You kind of have to dive deep into what exactly you're using and think about it a little bit, because I bet some things are not cut and dry. Even compost might not be cut and dry. So you need to take a little careful look at what you're using. And the treatment process is critical, because FDA separates treated versus untreated. As Betsy mentioned, FDA has always sort of beat the drums of, if you have any opportunity to use a treated BSAO, we would prefer, in terms of food safety, you to use treated BSAOs than untreated. That's just a given. And this summit really helped us to better understand that, hey, that's just not going to be possible in all cases, whether that be for infrastructure, cost, are probably the 2 biggest hurdles that we heard. manure is also good for soil tilth. It's good for soil fertility, and in some operations, manure is absolutely critical to maintain the health of soil. And this is where the risk assessment we're doing now is getting a better handle on. We've been receiving a lot of documents from NRCS to get a better understanding of how certain practices on the farm, in terms of cover cropping, for example, might just affect how pathogens could persist in the soil. So we're teasing these data points out in our risk assessment, among others. And I'm sort of talking through a slide I haven't even gotten to yet. I apologize. But these steps are pretty much where the guidance is broken down. And when you see it, the guidance document, I think it'll make a lot more sense. So as I talked before, this slide involves 112.56, and the blue highlight is where we codified the reserved section, which opened the door to probably one of the most significant risk assessments FDA has done in a long time. And this risk assessment we're doing is going to, we know we have the world's eyes on us. We are not, part of the, one of the benefits of this summit was to just broadcast how committed FDA is to this effort, how important this effort is to everybody. We understand that. And, but more importantly, and perhaps the most important message that I wanted to convey was that FDA we have not made up our minds what direction the risk assessment is going to take us. We don't know. There's a lot of talk lately about how averse the current administration is to science. They're not talking about FDA. FDA is developing science-based regulations. We are letting science in this area lead the model development in our risk assessment. But we're also paying attention to a lot of other things that might be more anecdotal, because we know the grower community may or may not base their practices on science. So we need to understand the reasons behind some of these practices in order to make sure we have feasible legislation. So that's kind of the way we're approaching this whole concept. We're all inclusive. We're all in. We've funded a heck of a lot of studies to actually reduce the variability associated with these data points that we've received over the last couple of years. So these commission studies, so this slide includes all of the information. We're soaking everything up like a sponge. Where we have punched a lot of money into are these commission studies. Over the last 10 years even, we've spent millions to get a better handle on specific information, that specific data where our gaps are quite large. And we've also broadcast, if you haven't seen it, this Federal Register notice for the data gaps. They included all the data gaps we're interested in to fuel the risk assessment. Came in last year. I'll have you know that we received a lot of comment. We received about 60 large comments that some included data, some didn't, but all were useful. We're folding all of these comments into our risk assessment models. And if you didn't get a chance to comment or make a comment that speaks to the Federal Register notice for the risk assessment, the data stream it's not closed. We would still ask you to submit comments either to my office directly or the risk assessment team, which is on the last slide of my presentation. So some of these commission studies that we have funded over the last several years involved a lot of scientists from all over the country. And we took the opportunity to get everybody together under one roof to discuss data sets, to discuss data gaps, to discuss the science. We discussed methods, and that was probably the coolest thing that I took home from everyone's discussion was, hey, based on the methods that we used for some of these studies, we can now compare directly the microbial populations under these conditions to help fuel our risk assessment and reduce the variability associated with single studies. So we've got a heck of a large meta-analysis going on right now, including all of these commission studies. And our data gaps are and variability associated with the data gaps are getting smaller and smaller. And we do expect to have a model, a basic model, sometime this year. We're working very hard to generate some template that we can build on. So what are some of these studies that we commissioned over the last several years? A lot, and these studies run the gamut. I mean, from the actual prevalence of human pathogens in poultry litter or cattle manure, the diversity, survival dynamics of these pathogens in the farm environment, as well as soil and water. We're looked at survival on produce directly, as well as transfer potential, transfer coefficients from soil splash, from scat that might be on a field. All of these studies are great. You haven't seen these studies because most of them are not published yet, but we're working on that. So the growers in the audience of the Soil Summit were very pleased, I think, to learn how many variables and factors that the risk assessment, the FDA risk assessment, is actually looking at. And if you look at all of the impacting factors here, on the right-hand side of the slide, the green bullets, these include all the variables that we're looking at. But we learned in the Soil Summit that we really covered the gamut, but not quite everything. So we're going to be including a few more in this mix, but we haven't updated the slide yet. So everywhere from soil type down to the actual microbe that we're talking about. The manure type was very important. Some growers only have access to one type of manure, so why should they be worried about the other types of manure? This is going to be a very detailed, very thorough, scalable risk assessment that will address all of these points. So I think we alleviated a lot of fears. First of all, that FDA has not made up their mind about how raw manure is going to be used or addressed in future guide regulations, if we have any future regulations. Second of all, we're being thorough, and we're asking for input, and there are no surprises here. So what are we doing now? All right, so the next steps, obviously we need to get these studies published for everybody, so everybody can review through the peer-reviewed literature. We're not so interested in well, we specifically don't need that to happen to move forward, but I think you'll be pleased when you read these papers. But we're actually more interested in the raw data, because the raw data is where the fun happens for our risk models. But we're looking at every comment that comes into us. We're looking at, so we're not done yet. We're far from being done in terms of gathering information. We're actually commissioning some new studies going on. I don't know if they have been cleared yet for me to discuss them, but they probably will by the next call. So, and this is $500,000 that we just got this year. Thank goodness we slipped it under the rug before the funding went away. So I actually have secured a lot more money to do some pretty cool stuff, which I can talk about maybe next call if we get the opportunity. But the risk assessment model is underway. What's going to happen when we produce a model is the risk assessment team will produce a model that will bring this model to our risk management team, and the risk management team will assess all the factors associated with the model, determine where to go, and that may be to reopen the docket. Well, we'll obviously have to publish the risk assessment for public comment, so everybody will get a chance to review the model, comment on the model. Once we get those comments back, we will reevaluate the model, make any adjustments, and then publish a final model. So this is going to be quite a long process involving comment review process. But once that's done, our risk management team may decide to use that model to propose new legislation, new regulations, to take out the reserved component of 112.56 and maybe include some actual intervals associated with untreated BSAOs. We're not sure what that's going to look like yet, and I expect if we do propose new regulations, everyone will have a say. We will go back through and repropose what we think is appropriate, have a chance for grower input, and then adjust as necessary to make sure that what we propose is feasible. So that's where we're at. And the risk assessment team, you could send note to any one of us, Dr. Chen, Yuhuan Chen, Dr. David Oriang. Stephen Duray was originally with us. He has moved on back. He went back to France to explore other opportunities, but he did a great job helping us get off the ground. And Jane Van Doren, please send comment to Jane Van Doren, and she'll trickle it down to all of us. So the Division of Risk Assessment, Risk and Decision Analysis is the group that's leading this effort. I am acting as liaison from the Division of Produce Safety. And as let's see, what time is it? I have about 15 minutes to answer any questions before I have to catch my flight. I really appreciate the time today to talk about this effort. It's very important to us, and I hope I've conveyed that message. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dave. While you were speaking, I think I saw a question come in from Nick Andrews. So Nick, I'm going to unmute your line. Go ahead.
Actually, Dave answered that question, but I was wondering if an example of what the model might generate as far as, what it might predict. And it sounds like FDA staff would be using the model to create regulations. Is that correct, or are you anticipating that farmers and others would be using it to assess risk on their own farms?
Well, I appreciate that. I can tell you what I'd like to see, and that is, I'd like to see an app. If I could look into the future, I would love growers to be able to use a web-based platform or application that you can use on your phone to actually dial in specific, specific practices to basically tailor the provisions based on your practices. Because one thing that we're working now is to get a better understanding of how the same practice, the grower practice manure use, say in Florida, how does that relate to the same application rates and timing under the hot Arizona sun? How would that affect the population size of potential pathogens in the growing environment? I expect to be very different growth curves. So we would like, what I would like to see when all this is said and done is some easy grower-friendly mechanisms for structuring their provisions based on their practices in the regions. So that's just what that's just me, and I'm doing what I can to help lead the process towards that. Does that sound like something that would be useful to you?
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. One comment, though, I would encourage you guys to spend a bit of time doing some usability testing, when you get to that point, just to make sure that it's user-friendly.
Hey, roger that. I think that's important. Thank you.
Yeah, and Dave, as a follow-up comment to that, someone else pointed out that, smartphone apps are great, but not to forget about other communities of growers, like plain growers who do use untreated manure, but might not have access to those apps. So other types of, risk assessment tools that they can use that don't involve that type of technology.
Yes, thank you, Gretchen. I appreciate that too. We don't want to we don't want to leave anybody out of the mix. That's true.
Okay, I saw Chris Callahan had a question. Chris, go ahead.
Hey, Dave, thanks, first of all, for all your work on this, and also for presenting the summary today. The question I had was the approach that you outlined, this, commission studies and a broader community of inquiry makes a heck of a lot of sense, obviously. Is it happening, is it standardized within FDA? Can we expect the same sort of approach in other areas that folks are concerned about?
Thanks, Chris. Good to hear from you. So I can I'm sort of reading between the lines. You're thinking along the lines of what we're doing with water.
For example, yeah.
Okay, so I really can't speak to how, I know we've publicly announced that we're looking at the water requirements. I can't speak to any extent, mainly because I don't know anything. So that group is working day and night. I can tell you, I've seen them. They're working very hard to coming up, to reevaluating some of the provisions and that water subpart. So I think you can expect to hear something soon, but I don't know specifically what the process is for them. But I can tell you that we do have a federal, there is a regulatory process for proposing new regulations, and whatever new regulation, for example, if we decide that we need to, based on our data sets, our risk assessment, that we need to remove that bracketed reserved in subpart F, we have to go through the entire process of reproposing new regulations. And that means we have to make a proposed rule, we have to have time for public comment, and then we have to, then submit the final based on a comment. So it's quite an extensive process that we go through for any regulation. It's an extremely well-vetted process that we go through, because we know that whatever we regulate is going to be maybe burdened. So we want to make sure we're very careful in how we approach the industry.
Thanks, Dave.
Yes, sir.
Okay, are there any other questions before we move on to a few quick wrap-up slides? Give you one last chance here for Dave before he hops on a plane back home. Nope. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it back over to Betsy to wrap things up here.
Yep. Okay, so just very quickly, I think there's going to be, we've already had a question about when do we expect the paper to be finished. So here's our next steps. We're going to summarize the notes and the outcomes and send this information with the notes from all the breakout groups and some evaluation information to the attendees, and look for feedback and try and flesh out any perspectives, or essentially get other perspectives if we didn't capture them properly, or put that out there so people can provide feedback. We did have a structure of a white paper, an outline that we had done prior to going into the Soil Summit, which is what helped us sort of come up with the breakout topics that we wanted to talk about. So we have some structure. We want to take that information, put it in, organize some working groups who are interested in dealing with that so we can clarify that. And then, as Dave mentioned, we have had interest from other groups. Right now, November 30th and December 1st, there is some discussion of having another one of these in Atlanta with Beth Bland, who is the Grow organization down in Georgia. I don't know if that's 100% official yet, but we do know there has been that discussion. If there are other folks on the call who are thinking, Dave mentioned 2 other areas, it's getting bigger as we go, maybe the West Coast, maybe the Midwest North. If you're interested and you want us to share how we did it or have some assistance, please let us know. I definitely want to have a special thanks to the Soil Summit attendees for being open-minded, showing up to do something kind of new and different, and their willingness to participate. Absolutely key to the outcomes we had. Certainly to FDA, Dave, Amir, and the rest of the team for coming willing to listen, willing to share. I think the question from Chris Callahan, I think we all feel this has been a bit of a novel experience, and I think that came across rather vividly at the Soil Summit. Jean Bonatal, of course, for coming. She was only able to be with us on the second day, but I think her participation was really important. And I cannot thank the PSA and the Institute for Food Safety at Cornell University teams enough for facilitating the breakout sessions, cramming the notes into a computer so we had something to gather up. So I really appreciate that facilitation. Are there any other questions, comments, or thoughts? Anybody want to share anything? Otherwise, we're going to move to some additional slides that tell you the next educators call.
I did see that Lori had a question or a comment, so go ahead, Lori. You're unmuted.
I would just say that what area would be interested in the Soil Summit if possible.
Okay, great. So we'll follow up with you, Lori, and see what our options are for doing that or setting something up. I appreciate the volunteering. You may not later, but I appreciate it on the front side. Anybody else? Okay. Then our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for June the 6th at 2 p.m. Absolutely appreciate our educators group and the people that join in this group. It seems to be getting a little larger every day. We would like to talk to you about where we're at with the PSA training numbers and outreach, talk about some new resources we have. As always, we are open to adding other discussion topics if there's something you want to do. There is a huge note. Cornell University is moving away from WebEx, so we will have to move to a new system called Zoom. So be prepared for a new system. We will, of course, send instructions. Again, I say we, but we all know that it's Gretchen that keeps us all on the computer and humming along. So we will make sure that we provide all of that information, and as always, it will be very well laid out so you can follow it. As always, here's the PSA team and our regional extension associates. I want to let you know that we are hiring in the Northwest. If anyone is interested in applying for that job, let me know. We have a job description. It is out there and available, and we would love to have somebody in the Northwest.
And that was also shared through the listserv in the reminder email yesterday, the link to that position description and the link to apply. Great.
See, she's wonderful. So here's all of our contact information if you want to get a hold of any of us. Trainings are ongoing. I've had a few questions about any additional train the trainers. There's several that we're trying to get finalized that you will see on the website. So if you need to get to a train the trainer or have colleagues who need to get to a train the trainer, there are going to be more available. They're just in the scheduling process. As Elizabeth mentioned, we do have one in New York, which NECAFs would support people attending. We also have support for New York people to attend that meeting through Ag and Market, so lots of good support to attend that meeting. And with that, I thank you all for your time. I'll give Gretchen and Dave one last shot, or Elizabeth, since you presented, one last shot to say any final words before everybody logs off.
Thanks for the opportunity again. I appreciate it, and I highly, highly, highly encourage anyone interested in supporting a summit to utilize Produce Safety Alliance. I can't thank Produce Safety Alliance enough for running such a successful event. They're obviously experts at what they do, and we rely on them for a lot of things. So thank you, Betsy and Gretchen and the rest of your team.
Thanks, Dave. Elizabeth, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that. Thank you to PSA and Dave for doing this webinar and co-hosting with us. It's much appreciated.
Yep, we certainly appreciate everything you and Chris do at NECAFS, and I think that's going very, very well. All right, thanks FDA for being on the call. Thanks Elizabeth and Chris for being on the call. Thank you Gretchen Wall for making sure we're online and working.
You're welcome, and thanks for everyone for joining today. We'll send out the meeting recording and notes here in the next couple days, so have a great rest of your week.
Take care.